The California sun beat down on Burbank with relentless intensity that Wednesday afternoon in July 1955. The air shimmered above the asphalt outside Warner Brothers Studios, where a growing crowd of fans had gathered since lunchtime. Most were teenage girls, their summer dresses forming a kaleidoscope of pastels against the studio's imposing concrete walls. They clutched magazines, photographs, and scraps of paper, whispering excitedly among themselves as they waited for a glimpse of Hollywood's newest sensation. Among them stood Mary Thompson, a slender girl of 17 with honey-brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Unlike the other girls who huddled in animated groups, Mary stood slightly apart, one hand nervously smoothing down the skirt of her pale blue dress. In her other hand, she gripped a carefully folded piece of stationery, its edges already soft from hours of anxious handling. "He probably won't even come this way," muttered the girl beside her, a redhead wearing cat-eye glasses and an expression of practiced cynicism. "Dennis from my brother's class works as a runner, and he says they've been using the back exit all week because of the crowds." Mary nodded but said nothing, her eyes fixed on the gate. She had taken 3 buses to get here from Glendale, leaving home before dawn with a hastily concocted story about visiting the library. Her mother would be furious if she knew the truth, that Mary had skipped her shift at the pharmacy to stand outside a movie studio on the off chance of seeing James Dean. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Some fans drifted away, defeated by the heat and disappointment. Others arrived to take their place, bringing fresh energy and speculation. Mary stayed rooted to her spot, occasionally dabbing at her forehead with a handkerchief, the folded note growing damper in her palm. "You really think he's something, don't you?" It was the redhead again, her initial dismissiveness softening into curiosity. Mary finally turned to look at her. "I saw East of Eden 7 times, she admitted, a flush creeping up her neck that had nothing to do with the heat. "My dad says it's a waste of money, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain what James Dean's portrayal of Cal Trask had meant to her, how she'd recognized her own feelings of alienation and longing for acceptance in his performance. The redhead, who introduced herself as Doris, nodded knowingly. "My mom says he's trouble, which just makes me like him more." She grinned, and Mary found herself smiling back, grateful for the momentary distraction from her nerves. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd's enthusiasm waxed and waned. False alarms rippled through the gathering whenever the gate opened, only to reveal ordinary studio employees who looked either amused or annoyed by the commotion. Mary's feet ached in her best pair of saddle shoes, and doubt began to creep in. This was foolish. Even if he did appear, why would James Dean, who had Hollywood at his feet and probably received hundreds of letters every day, pay any attention to hers? At 4:17 p.m., Mary had been checking her watch obsessively. A murmur ran through the crowd. The gate was opening again, but this time the reaction was different. A collective intake of breath, followed by excited whispers that quickly crescendoed into squeals and calls. Mary stood on tiptoe, straining to see past the heads in front of her. And then, suddenly, there he was. James Dean emerged from the studio grounds with the casual confidence of someone unaware of their own magnetism. He wore dark pants and a simple white t-shirt under a red jacket, a cigarette dangling from his lips in that now familiar pose that teenagers across America were already imitating. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd just run his hand through it, and he squinted slightly in the bright afternoon light. The crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of excitement breaking against the security guards who quickly moved to form a protective barrier. Dean paused, seemingly taken aback by the enthusiasm, before his face settled into the half-smile that had launched 1,000 daydreams in high school classrooms nationwide. "Jimmy, over here. James, can I have your autograph? We love you, Jimmy." The calls blended into a cacophony as fans pressed forward, thrusting photographs and magazines toward him. Dean took a pen from his jacket pocket and began to sign, moving along the line of security guards, exchanging brief words with each fan. Mary found herself being pushed forward by the momentum of the crowd. Her carefully rehearsed words evaporated from her mind as she watched him draw closer. That face she knew so well from the silver screen and countless magazine photographs now animated in real life, more vivid and human than she had imagined. There was a weariness around his eyes that the cameras didn't capture, a slight tension in his jaw as he maintained his public persona. He was just a few feet away now. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs with such force she was certain everyone could hear it. Doris had disappeared somewhere in the crush, and Mary stood alone again, clutching her letter with white knuckles as the gap between them closed. Then he was there, right in front of her, separated only by the outstretched arm of a burly security guard. Up close, Dean was smaller than she'd expected, more compact, but his presence seemed to fill the space around him. His eyes, those expressive eyes that had conveyed such depth of emotion on screen, now flicked to her face, questioning. Mary's mouth went dry. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she extended her hand with the folded paper, a silent offering. "It's for you," she finally managed, her voice barely audible above the surrounding commotion. A letter. For a heartbeat, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, Dean's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He reached out, his fingers briefly brushing hers as he took the folded paper. Their eyes met for a moment. A real connection, not the practiced look he had been giving the other fans. Something in his gaze seemed to recognize something in hers, an understanding that passed between them without words. "Thank you," he said simply, and slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. Then he was moving on, swept along by his handlers and the press of the crowd. Mary stood frozen, her empty hand still partially extended, as if holding on to that brief moment of connection. "Did you see that? He took your letter." Doris was suddenly beside her again, grabbing her arm in excitement. "What did you write to him? Was it your address? Do you think he'll write back?" Mary couldn't answer. The reality of what had just happened was still sinking in. James Dean, the James Dean, had her letter in his pocket. The words she had agonized over for weeks, rewritten a dozen times, would soon be read by him. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the crowd began to disperse, Dean having disappeared into a waiting car, Mary allowed herself to be pulled along toward the bus stop. Doris chattered excitedly beside her, but Mary's mind was elsewhere, following that folded piece of paper, imagining Dean reading her words, wondering if they would mean anything to him or simply be discarded like so many others. The afternoon sun was finally losing some of its intensity as Mary boarded the bus that would take her part of the way home. She found a seat by the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the studio recede in the distance. She had done it, accomplished the seemingly impossible task she had set for herself. Whether anything came of it or not, she had reached across the vast divide between her ordinary life and the glittering world of James Dean. For this moment, that was enough. What Mary couldn't know, as the bus pulled away from the curb, was that Dean had already paused by his silver Porsche in the studio parking lot, curious about the earnest girl and the letter she had pressed into his hand with such quiet determination. She couldn't see him leaning against the driver's door, unfolding her carefully chosen stationery to discover the words that would unexpectedly touch him more deeply than he could have anticipated. That part of the story was still to come. James Dean slipped into the driver's seat of his silver Porsche Spider, tossing his jacket onto the passenger seat beside him. The chaos of the fan encounter had left him drained, as these interactions always did. He enjoyed the adoration on one level. What actor didn't? But the constant performance exhausted him. Even now, alone in his car, he could feel himself slowly shedding the James Dean persona and returning to just Jimmy. He lit a fresh cigarette, inhaling deeply as he leaned his head back against the seat. That's when he felt something press against his side, the letter from the girl with the honest eyes. Unlike the glossy photographs and torn magazine pages thrust at him for autographs, this was personal, folded carefully, not crumpled or flashy, like its owner. Dean reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the letter. The paper was simple stationery, pale blue with a slight floral pattern at the edges. He unfolded it carefully, noting the neat, deliberate handwriting that filled the page. Not the looping, exaggerated script he usually received from fans declaring undying love, but something more measured, more real. "Dear Mr. Dean," it began. Already different, most girls called him Jimmy in their letters, claiming an intimacy that didn't exist. "My name is Mary Thompson. I'm 17 and live in Glendale. I don't expect you to remember this letter among the thousands you must receive, but I needed to write it anyway. I saw East of Eden 7 times. My father doesn't understand why I would spend my hard-earned money to see the same movie repeatedly. He says it's wasteful and impractical. Perhaps he's right, but each time I watched you portray Cal Trask, I felt less alone. You see, I know what it's like to be the one who doesn't quite fit, the one who tries but somehow always seems to be reaching for something just beyond grasp. In my house, my sister is the perfect one. Pretty, popular, practical. Everything makes sense to her. Nothing makes sense to me, except when I watch you on screen. There's a scene where Cal learns the truth about his mother, and the look on your face. It was exactly how I felt when I overheard my father tell my mother that he sometimes wonders if I'll ever find my place in the world. Like I'm some puzzle piece that doesn't fit anywhere. I'm not writing this for an autograph or a response. I just wanted you to know that what you do matters. When you act, you make people like me believe we're not invisible, that our complicated feelings are real and valid. Please don't ever stop being yourself, Mr. Dean, even when it's hard, even when no one understands. There are people watching who need to see someone like you succeed. Sincerely, Mary Thompson. At the bottom, she'd added her address, but with a small note. You don't need to write back. Just knowing you might read this is enough. Dean read the letter twice, then a third time. The cigarette between his fingers burned down. Forgotten. Around him, the parking lot had emptied as the day's filming wrapped up and crew members headed home to families, dinner tables, normal lives. His expression shifted from the practiced half-smile he wore for the public to something more vulnerable. The girl had seen through him somehow, not the carefully crafted rebel image that the studio was busy selling to America, but something truer. The parts of himself he actually put into his performances, the real emotions beneath the technique. Most fan letters focused on his looks, his style, the surface-level allure that made teenage girls swoon. This was different. This Mary Thompson had recognized something in him that he sometimes feared was invisible to everyone except himself. Dean folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. He started the Porsche's engine, the mechanical growl filling the quiet parking lot. He should head home. He had an early call time tomorrow, and Jack Warner himself had lectured him about punctuality just yesterday. Instead, he switched off the ignition. The security guard at the gate looked surprised to see Dean walking back toward the studio entrance where, even now, a handful of determined fans lingered in the fading afternoon light. "Forget something, Mr. Dean?" the guard asked. "Yeah," Dean replied, scanning the small group. "Someone." The initial crowd had thinned considerably. Most had caught buses home or dispersed to nearby diners to excitedly recount their brush with celebrity. But a few remained, either hoping for another glimpse or waiting for rides. Dean's eyes moved methodically over each face, searching, and there she was, the girl in the pale blue dress, standing apart from the others. She wasn't looking his way. Her attention was focused on a small notebook where she appeared to be writing something, perhaps recording her impression of their brief encounter, preserving the memory before it faded. She hadn't noticed him yet. For a moment, Dean simply observed her. The careful way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. There was a quietness to her that stood out in Hollywood, where everyone seemed to be constantly projecting, performing, demanding attention. Several of the remaining fans spotted him and began calling out, moving toward him with renewed excitement. The girl, Mary, looked up, startled by the commotion. Her eyes widened as she saw him walking deliberately in her direction. Dean felt a rare nervousness. On set, in character, he knew exactly what to say, how to move, how to feel. But here, as himself, responding to this girl who had somehow seen past his carefully constructed facade, he was unsure. The other fans pressed closer, but Dean sidestepped them with a practiced ease, his eyes never leaving Mary's increasingly bewildered face. The security guard, sensing his purpose, created a small buffer zone around them. Mary stood frozen, her notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. Up close, Dean could see the faint sprinkling of freckles across her nose, the mix of fear and hope in her eyes. "You wrote this," he said. Not a question but a statement, as he patted his jacket pocket where her letter rested. Mary nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Dean leaned in closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear his next words. The world around them, the other fans, the security guard, the studio gates, seemed to recede, creating a small island of privacy in the midst of public space. What he would say next would change everything for Mary Thompson, leaving an impression that would last long after the ink on her letter had faded. The world narrowed to a pinpoint around Mary as James Dean leaned in close. The cacophony of the remaining fans, the rumble of passing cars on the Burbank streets, even the persistent California heat, all of it faded into background noise as he spoke directly to her. "You see me up there on screen," he said, his voice low and intimate, meant only for her ears. "But you should know. I see you, too." Mary's breath caught in her throat. Up close, Dean's eyes were even more expressive than they appeared on film, intense, searching, and at this moment, surprisingly gentle. There was none of the practiced charm he displayed for photographers or in interviews. This was something else entirely, something real. "Your letter," he continued, one hand still resting over the pocket where it sat. "Most people write because they want something from me, an autograph, a photo, a story to tell their friends." He paused, studying her face as if committing it to memory. "You wrote because you had something to give." Mary's cheeks flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the late afternoon sun. She hadn't expected him to read her letter so soon, if at all. The thought that he had not only read it but had come back specifically to find her seemed impossible, like something from one of the movie magazines her sister collected. "I didn't write it to bother you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't bother me," Dean interrupted, a hint of his famous half-smile appearing. "You reminded me of something important." Around them, the remaining fans were growing increasingly curious and agitated, straining to hear what was being said. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between giving Dean his privacy and moving him along. "Mr. Dean, we should probably get you back inside if you're staying," the guard said, eyeing the growing tension in the small crowd. Dean nodded but didn't move away immediately. Instead, he held Mary's gaze for a moment longer. "Don't let anyone make you feel invisible," he said with unexpected intensity. "Not your father, not anyone. The world's full of people who'll try to tell you who to be, how to act, what's practical." His voice took on a sardonic edge at the last word, as if it were something he'd heard countless times himself. "But the truth is, the ones who don't fit, they're the ones who change things." Mary stood transfixed, barely breathing. This wasn't the practiced lines of a movie star. There was a rawness to his words, an urgency that suggested he wasn't just speaking to her but also to himself. "Thank you for the reminder, Mary Thompson from Glendale," he said, stepping back slightly. "Sometimes actors forget why we started doing this in the first place." With that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook and a stub of pencil. He scribbled something quickly, tore the page out and pressed it into her hand, folding her fingers over it. "That's for you," he said. "Not my autograph, something better." Before Mary could respond or even look at what he'd given her, a black car pulled up at the curb, honking impatiently. Dean glanced over his shoulder and sighed. "That's my ride. Dinner with the studio executives." He made a face that conveyed exactly what he thought of such obligations. Then, with one last direct look that seemed to cut through all pretense, he added, "Keep writing, Mary. Your words matter." With that, he turned and strode toward the waiting car, immediately swarmed by the remaining fans. The security guard moved to clear a path, and within moments, Dean was sliding into the back seat. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a chorus of disappointed sighs in its wake. Mary stood rooted to the spot, her hand still closed tightly around the paper he'd given her. It was only when the car had disappeared from view that she finally unfurled her fingers to look at what Dean had written. It wasn't his signature, as she might have expected. Instead, in slightly messy handwriting, he had scrawled, "The invisible ones change the world. Remember that when it gets hard. J.D." Below that was a small sketch, not detailed but unmistakably a rendering of two eyes, looking directly at the viewer, at her. Mary's vision blurred as tears welled up unexpectedly. It wasn't sadness that prompted them, but something more complex, a feeling of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. The barriers between them, his fame, her ordinariness, the entire machinery of Hollywood that should have made such a genuine exchange impossible, had momentarily dissolved. In that moment, James Dean wasn't the unattainable movie star whose face adorned magazine covers across America. He was simply someone who understood what it felt like to be an outsider, to be searching for connection in a world that often seemed indifferent. The note trembled in Mary's hand as she carefully folded it and tucked it into her notebook for safekeeping. Around her, the last of the fans were dispersing, disappointed at Dean's departure but already spinning tales about how close they'd been to him, what he'd been wearing, how he'd looked their way. None of them noticed the quiet girl in the pale blue dress who stood apart, or the profound effect a brief conversation had had on her. They couldn't see the transformation taking place, how her posture had straightened slightly, how the habitual defensiveness in her expression had given way to something more open, more confident. As Mary finally turned to leave, making her way toward the bus stop where she would begin her journey back to Glendale, she felt different. The world around her looked the same streets, the same buildings, the same indifferent passers-by, but something fundamental had shifted within her. James Dean, the brightest star in Hollywood's firmament, had paused in his meteoric rise to acknowledge her existence. More than that, he had validated what she had always felt but never dared to express, that being different wasn't something to overcome, but something to embrace. The bus arrived and Mary climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window. As the vehicle pulled away from Warner Brothers Studios, she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the gates recede into the distance. The tears that had been threatening since Dean's departure finally spilled over, running silently down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of sadness or even simple happiness. They were tears of recognition, the profound emotional release that comes from finally being acknowledged for exactly who you are. What Mary couldn't know, as the bus carried her back toward her ordinary life, was how much her simple, honest letter had affected Dean as well, how her words would stay with him during the coming months of filming Rebel Without a Cause, providing a reminder of why his work mattered beyond box office numbers and critical acclaim. That part of the story was still unfolding. The bus ride home passed in a blur for Mary. She barely noticed the familiar landmarks of Burbank giving way to Glendale, her mind replaying every second of her encounter with James Dean. Her fingers kept returning to the folded note in her pocket, tracing its edges as if to confirm it was real and not some elaborate daydream. By the time she stepped off at her stop, twilight had settled over the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered on one by one as she walked the 3 blocks to her family's modest bungalow. The windows glowed with warm light, and through the front window she could see her mother setting the dinner table while her father sat in his armchair, reading the evening paper. For a moment, Mary hesitated on the sidewalk. How could she walk back into her ordinary life carrying this extraordinary experience? How could she sit through dinner, answering routine questions about her day at the library, when what she really wanted was to shout from the rooftops that James Dean had seen her, truly seen her? Taking a deep breath, she climbed the porch steps and pushed open the front door. "There you are," her mother called from the dining room. "We were beginning to worry. Was the library that interesting today?" Mary hung her cardigan on the hook by the door. "Sorry I'm late. I lost track of time." "Well, wash up for dinner. Your sister's already helping in the kitchen." Mary nodded and headed toward the bathroom, grateful for a few more moments alone. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, finally allowing herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Pulling Dean's note from her pocket, she read it again, running her fingers over the indentations his pencil had made in the paper. "The invisible ones change the world. Remember that when it gets hard. J.D." The small sketch of eyes looking back at her seemed almost alive in the bathroom's harsh light. Not the practiced, brooding gaze that millions of teenagers had fallen for, but something more personal, a recognition, a connection. Mary carefully folded the note and tucked it into her diary, which she kept hidden beneath her underwear in her dresser drawer. This was too precious to share, even with her best friend Nancy. Some experiences were meant to be private, cherished in silence. At dinner, Mary picked at her meatloaf and mashed potatoes while her sister Susan chatted enthusiastically about being chosen for the school dance committee. "Mary, you're a million miles away," her father remarked, studying her over his glasses. "Did something happen today?" Mary looked up, momentarily panicked that her deception would be discovered. But what she saw in her father's face wasn't suspicion. It was genuine curiosity. When was the last time he had really looked at her like that, with interest rather than concern or disappointment? "I just had an unexpected conversation today," she said carefully, "with someone who understood something about me that I didn't think anyone could understand." Her father's eyebrows rose slightly. "At the library?" Mary hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't entirely a lie. Dean's words had been like reading a book that somehow contained her own thoughts, her own feelings, a message meant precisely for her. "Well, that's nice," her mother said, passing the green beans. "Isn't it, Richard?" Mary's always had such a thoughtful nature. Her father studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Yes, she has. Different from Susan, but special in her own way. It was a small thing, just a few words, but Mary felt them land like a revelation. Different, but special. Not deficient, not difficult, not a problem to be solved. Just different. Had her father always thought this, or had something in her demeanor changed, allowing him to see her differently? The conversation moved on, but Mary carried those words with her, placing them alongside Dean's in a growing collection of evidence that perhaps she wasn't as invisible as she had always believed. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but profound shifted in Mary's life. She joined the school newspaper, submitting an opinion piece about how films like East of Eden were changing the way teenagers saw themselves. Her English teacher, surprised by her sudden participation, encouraged her to enter a statewide writing contest. When Mary received notice that her essay had been selected as a finalist, she found herself standing at the mailbox, letter in hand, wishing she could somehow share the news with James Dean. Would he be proud of her for finding her voice? Would he remember their brief encounter, or had it been just one forgettable moment in his increasingly chaotic life? In late September, Mary and Nancy went to see Rebel Without a Cause on opening weekend. The theater was packed with teenagers, many sporting red jackets in homage to Dean's character, Jim Stark. Mary watched in silence, mesmerized by Dean's performance, the vulnerability beneath the tough exterior, the longing for understanding that mirrored what she had expressed in her letter. "He's even dreamier in this one," Nancy whispered, clutching Mary's arm during a close-up. Mary nodded but said nothing. Her connection to Dean felt too personal to reduce to teenage adulation. She watched his every gesture, every expression, wondering if any part of their conversation had influenced his portrayal of Jim Stark, another misunderstood youth seeking genuine connection. Walking home after the movie, Nancy chattered excitedly about Dean's good looks and rebel persona. Mary listened politely, keeping her own thoughts private. How could she explain that when she looked at James Dean, she didn't just see a handsome movie star, but a messenger who had delivered a vital truth precisely when she needed to hear it? When the terrible news came on September 30th, 1955, Mary was in chemistry class. The school secretary appeared at the classroom door, whispering something to Mr. Peterson, who then cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've just been informed that the actor James Dean has been killed in an automobile accident in California," he announced, his tone suggesting he wasn't quite sure why this warranted interrupting his lesson. A collective gasp went through the classroom. Several girls began to cry openly. Someone in the back row whispered, "No way, that can't be true." Mary sat perfectly still, her hands gripping the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room seemed to tilt around her, voices becoming distant and muffled. This couldn't be happening. Not Dean. Not when he had just begun to make his mark on the world. Not when his words were still guiding her toward a new understanding of herself. After school, Mary walked to the park instead of going straight home. She sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, finally allowing her tears to fall freely. She cried not only for the loss of a brilliant young actor, but for the loss of a kindred spirit, someone who had recognized in her what few others could see. As dusk settled over the park, Mary pulled Dean's note from her pocket where she had taken to carrying it every day. "The invisible ones change the world," she read again through her tears. Now, these words felt like both a comfort and a responsibility, a torch passed to her to carry forward. In the months and years that followed, as James Dean was transformed from promising young actor to eternal cultural icon, Mary kept her brief encounter with him private. Even as friends and classmates displayed magazine clippings and posters, even as "Remember the Day When" stories circulated with increasingly embellished details, Mary held her truth close. The note eventually faded with handling, the pencil marks growing fainter, but Dean's words remained indelibly etched in Mary's heart. While the world mourned the rebel, the icon, the symbol of youthful defiance, Mary mourned the person, the young man who had taken a moment to truly see a shy girl from Glendale, and, in doing so, had changed her life. In the fall of 1957, when Mary's first short story was published in her college literary magazine, she dedicated it simply, "For J.D., who taught me that being invisible isn't the same as not existing." It was her way of completing the circle, of honoring not just what James Dean had meant to millions of fans, but what he had meant specifically to her, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures leave the deepest mark, and that our briefest connections can become our most enduring legacy.